recording up to the cloud, which we are, and now I'm going to turn it over.
Good. Please be seated. Thank you. My name is Mark Simons, and I'm an attorney. I've been practicing law for 27 years, 28 years, somewhere in there, doesn't matter. And I've been coaching and teaching and judging for about the past 12 years. My other judges are going to introduce themselves. Then we're going to come back to you so you can introduce yourselves and your team and your coach. And then we'll engage with question 1. Thank you.
My name is Charlie Hinderleiter. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for St. Louis Realtors in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm a former political science professor, and once upon a time I was on that side of the, well, you're actually at a table, as a student in the We the People program, and I'm looking forward to our conversation this afternoon.
Hi, I'm Karen Milton from New York. I'm a lawyer by training. I have been a public servant pretty much my entire career, working in the New York City, New York State, and federal governments. Currently, I'm the Chief of Staff for the Inspector General of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. That's the New York State agency that oversees New York City subways and buses and the commuter rails for the New York metropolitan area. Prior to this, I was the circuit executive of the Second Circuit, which is the federal grouping of the 13 federal courts in the states of New York, Vermont, and Connecticut. And the circuit executive is more or less like the chief operating officer. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and delighted to have a conversation on Unit 1.
I'm Lane Aerosmith.
I'm Kendra King.
I'm Andrea Moore.
I'm Kyle Rose.
I'm Easton Kyle. We are all seniors at Laurel High School, instructed by Mr. Deming.
Thank you. Now, you've waited a long time to get to us, so we're anxious because we wait a long time to get to you too. So remember this, take a deep breath, have fun. I'm going to start with the question, and then when I conclude, begin when you're ready. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times?
The Constitution was formed by a mix of revolutionary leaders, revolutionary ideas during a revolutionary time in history. The colonists knew independence brought on a need for a law of the land, something to create stipulations for the government that the people were still weary of due to previous neglect. First, we created the Articles of Confederation, but it was soon apparent that they needed amending. At the Philadelphia Convention, with 55 delegates and missing one state, they reformed the Articles, creating our Constitution. It's important to note the people involved and to see that many of them were revolutionaries themselves, including George Washington, who led the Continental Army, James Madison being one of the youngest revolutionary leaders, and others as well. This shows that the basis of the document itself was brought on by those who saw the need for change, emphasizing the role of revolution in the writing of our Constitution.
The Articles of Confederation at the time had 4 major problems that needed to be addressed, being that the government had no power to tax, couldn't make states follow agreements with foreign nations, couldn't regulate trade amongst the states, and had no power to make laws regarding the behavior of citizens. Many people knew the Articles were weak, as the government couldn't raise funds. People, especially soldiers, couldn't pay their debts, so fear gripped hold, and it took a major event, this being Shays' Rebellion, to convince people a change was needed. When we look towards displaying these principles, we can look to the election of 1800. Here we saw the first time in recent history where power was transferred not by violence or hereditary succession, but by an electoral revolution. While both parties held negative feelings towards each other, both parties accepted the result of the election and power was transferred peacefully.
When looking at bullet 1, we can see that consent can interfere with the amendment process in many different ways. We can see that the concept of consent can nullify amendments such as the pairing of the 18th and the 21st Amendments. Consent can also lead to the introduction of amendments such as the quartering of soldiers and the Third Amendment. And since our government is run through elected officials, consent can be questioned when it comes to the election of those officials, such as if a person votes for another candidate or doesn't vote at all. Consent can also be questioned when it comes to the concept of election fraud. Consent cannot be given if an elected official stole the seat that they sit in. We can also see that consent isn't necessarily guaranteed once an official is in office. The people can rescind their consent at any time if an official starts to do things that the people do not agree with. If consent isn't given in any circumstance, government action becomes illegitimate. And if government action is deemed illegitimate and is not addressed, it can lead to the people taking action to fix what they deem an oppressive government, just like the founders did over 200 years ago.
To answer the last bullet, James Otis was a lawyer during the colonial period of our history. He was fighting over the privacy battle that was currently going on. He, along with many others, were concerned over the illegal searches and seizures from the British. The British would issue a writ of assistance and search a general area such as the Boston Harbor. And they would take anything they wanted to. This topic is equally important as the Stamp Act and Tea Act, but not talked about as much. One has the right to defend their home, as stated in the original Castle Doctrine brought up by Sir Edward Coke in 1604. Privacy is also included in the Fourth Amendment. As well as that, a Castle Doctrine has found its way into many state constitutions. Throughout history, the issue of privacy continues to be a big concern for many individuals. Some are even willing to defend it with deadly force.
We also see in modern times a revolutionary principle of checks and balances in place to limit the government's coercive power, which Benjamin Rush has addressed the people of the United States and many others found to be a major problem of government at the time. In linking this to action today, we see that the steps of the impeachment process have been tried on the former president of the United States, one of those instances where the president wasn't in office, which brings into question the overall power of checks and balances. Today, we see popular sovereignty through consent of the government and public education. Although the enterprise of consent of the governed is evident today, it is possible to see citizens rebuff that they have any say in matters when the government enacts laws over them that they do not agree with. We are now ready for your questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Let's start with state constitutions. Many states regularly amend their constitutions in the modern era. How do you think that relates to this notion of consent that you guys have been discussing?
This just shows that consent can be changed and we should do exactly what the people want and what they vote for.
I think a lot of that has to do with too, is that with many different groups of people in the United States being very diverse too, it reinforces the idea of popular sovereignty, which kind of gives the idea of consent and where it gets its authority from and how it gets its political legitimacy.
This also brings up the idea of how different people view the Constitution. Like say, if you view it from a textual basis, or if you view it from a more modern basis. And we can see that these states are figuring out that we need different amendments as we grow as a country and as we simply come together as a nation. So we can see that through the different ideas of looking through the constitutions, we have seen these amendments pop up as well.
Do you think we're coming together as a country these days with all of the many different views being espoused by different groups? So how do you reconcile this idea of the consent of the governed, where we don't have 100% of the population participating in elections? You have groups feeling that if their candidate didn't win, then the election must be illegitimate. How do we reconcile the consent of the governed, the idea that your elected representatives may pass laws that you yourself do not agree with? How did the founders think we were going to address these issues?
I know one of the founders, he kind of thought that in general, the political parties would be one of the downfalls of our country. James Madison believed that factions would inevitably lead to our country being in turmoil. And I think that necessarily the types of consent is where we have to kind of see where, even though you may not have had your political leader in office through express consent, you still voted for your opposing person, and that hypothetical consent that John Rawls believed that the United States is under today, that you expressed your consent in that regard as well.
And while nobody is going to agree on one candidate 100%, that's why it's important that we have faith in our voting system. So then we see that even if people disagree with what the person is doing in power, we can see, okay, well, this is what the majority of people wanted. And as long as we have faith in that system and that person is installed rightfully, people are okay.
We can also see that even when people don't vote, that was their own choice, and that's them expressing their opinion on the candidates and in their own voting system. If they decide not to vote, that is giving their consent to whoever is elected.
And another way to help combat this issue is simply through education, considering we have seen a considerable drop off from what the founders believed was right for education. In fact, we have simply fallen out of some of these schools even teaching what we're in right now, civics classes, learning about our government. So simply giving educational courses through any means necessary at this moment could actually increase these as well.
Okay, I'm going to bring us a little bit more current, but tied into the historical foundation of the right to revolt and to challenge the government. So how do you view the current events such as the BLM protests, riots, whatever you want to call it, the events at the Capitol, January 6th? How do you relate those events back to the concepts of revolution and the right of the individual?
Well, we see that the Black Lives Matter protests, they were not against the government necessarily, they were against police forces. And then we can also look at others where there was the Capitol protests, and that was against the government. So we can see that it does also depend on who they're protesting against and who they're trying to get action taken for.
And in a lot of these cases, we get to a point where violence isn't necessary. In either case is looking at the Capitol building or simply looking at these BLM protests and riots going on. Violence isn't always necessary here. Getting the word out and protesting in different ways doesn't have to mean burning buildings or breaking windows or scaling arguably one of the most important buildings to our nation and its history. So a lot of these don't need to resort into violence, but a lot of people take it to that point.
However, sometimes we do see the need for violence, as with the founders. They revolted against the British king because of their mistreatment that they felt they had experienced. We see, and excuse me if I misquote this, the people will suffer ills as long as ills are sufferable. Unfortunately, sometimes it does come to that, and peaceful protests and boycotts, unfortunately, those don't always work, and sometimes you end up in violence because the people feel they have no other choice.
What we saw in the colonial times, the Boston Tea Party, when they threw over all the tea over swords, that was a rebel. I guess you could say it led to a revolution, but I wouldn't say it would be like you could compare the BLM protests to that, because the BLM protests were revolting against the police force, opposed to the, back in colonial times, the Tea Party was revolting against a government.
So when does the right of revolution kick in? What's that line that justifies violence instead of peaceful protests?
I'd say that the line where revolution starts to become more of a necessity is when those higher institutions and governments can't make necessary reforms to protect those fundamental rights that kind of sparked our first revolution. The human rights that the Declaration kind of brought up and mainly articulated then.
And that's what we see. The purpose of our government is to protect our rights, and that's what the founders intended for. So if they're not doing so, we see that we should start to do something about it. And if nothing is done, or people are showing their distrust for the government and their need for change, then obviously we're going to see the protests go further.
Bringing in another point, talking about the just war theory, talking about how war should only be declared as a last resort. And in this case, violence should only be used as a last resort. There are many other options that we have, such as voting in different people if we feel they aren't getting the job done every 2, 4, or 6 years, depending on which term. So there are other options so far. So as a last resort, I would say is where we need to look for.
So who makes the decision that the government we have today, the government created by the founders, isn't working? At what point, going back to the idea of the line between peaceful protest, boycotts, and revolution, where do you see us going to revolution the way we did in 1775?
Well, that line is in the eye of the beholder, obviously, and some of us would say, yes, we do see that happening, and others would say no, and that things are perfectly fine. So it's all in the eyes of the beholder and what you believe.
And there is an argument to be made that the government has already failed in a sense that they don't always follow what the Constitution set forth, starting way back from Abraham Lincoln and the suspension of habeas corpus and talking about Theodore Roosevelt saying, if the Constitution didn't deny him the power, he would take every other power. Slow usurpations of power from this can also lead to a point to be said that the government is failing in their job.
All right, good job. Time limit. All right, yay, good job. Woohoo. Okay, now the judges will give some feedback.
I want to point out a couple things I really enjoyed in your opening statement. You guys are the first ones that we've heard today that mentioned the Revolution of 1800. I think that's something that's just too often overlooked as an important, just a critical moment in American history and even in world history where you had a peaceful transition of power. I thought that was a great example. You guys mentioned the Third Amendment, which is my personal favorite amendment. The framers knocked it out of the park with that one. I've never had to quarter some Marines in my second bedroom. But in more seriousness, you guys did a nice job of tracing the challenges that the framers saw and how they were able to try to address those in these critical documents. You did that with the Articles of Confederation. You talked about James Otis, the writs of assistance, just some great examples where you were able to trace how these historical contexts really impacted the documents and then how the philosophy kind of interacted with that. So I really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you.
Thought it was a great conversation. I particularly love quoting James Otis. People don't quote him enough anymore, or his wife, Mercy Otis. I really thought, I liked how you talked about the state constitutions. I liked how you started with the principles of the founders and brought us forward to today. I particularly love the line, revolution is in the eye of the beholder. Jefferson would love you. I really thought that was just some great catchphrases, and they're so good. You know, they evoke such imagery, which I always think is important when you're doing these oral presentations. So nicely done, well done. Thank you so much. I thought it was a great conversation. I wish it could have gone on. I have about 5 more notes I want to talk with you about to pick up where we left off. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take a little, I agree with everything that's been said on the feedback, but I'm going to give you a couple of little other ideas that I saw. First off, what I really wanted to see is the ability for you to understand the tension in the conflict in ideas and how that led to the founding fathers coming up with the concepts and where they were going and how that fed through time, because now you see the conflicts and you even see the current conflicts as it still unfolds, which isn't that far off from what the original ideas were, people standing up for their rights and how to do it. The other thing that I think is you guys did a really good job at is when you have a group setting like this, where you have a larger group of 5 participants, it's easy for 1 or 2 participants to back off and let somebody else carry the load. Well, that didn't happen. You worked as an excellent team where each of you provided some substantive context or substantive ideas that further along a question or a response. So you got to really give yourself kudos for that and say, look, we did a great job on doing that and supporting it. And lastly, don't forget, I mean, you guys are, and I don't think you have forgotten, you're in the nationals, you're at the highest level and you handled our questions. And I thought you had a great presentation. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, good job. Yay.